This father has 6 months to face the most painful experience of his life, handing his daughter over to a stranger, watching her get married, and learning to let her go. The happiest day of her life will be for him the hardest. But if he wants to remain a part of her life, he needs to understand. To love is also to know when to let go. 6 months earlier, George had no idea what was coming. He was at work, excited because Annie was returning from her exchange program. He gets the news that she has already landed and rushes home to see her. And there she is at the top of the stairs. George loses his breath, but something had changed. She looks different, radiant. She smells different. It's a new perfume, she says. A gift. George's alarms go off. But he doesn't ask. He just wants to make up for lost time. He suggests they go to a game or concert together, but Annie isn't thrilled. She's acting strange, nervous, and then she says it. I met someone, an American. His name is Brian McKenzie. We fell in love, and we're engaged. George's stomach turns. He can't even pretend to be happy. Annie shows the ring. She says it's over 100 years old. They bought it at a market. But George is furious. A market ring? He couldn't even buy her a decent one? He looks at his daughter, the little girl he raised from infancy, and he knows this is wrong. She didn't even want to get married. She used to say marriage was a trap for women, that she wanted a career first, her own money, her own life. And suddenly, she forgot all of that for a Brian she barely knows. George feels it in his chest. Annie's about to make the worst mistake of her life. He yells that she doesn't have his permission to marry. Annie jumps to her feet and storms out. Nina, his wife, confronts him. She warns him to stop speaking to Annie as if he could still control her. She's an adult now, and if he keeps pushing her like this, she might get married, leave, and disappear from their lives forever. Brian arrives, impeccably dressed and with a perfect smile. He's polite, kind, and charming. Everything seems fine. And that's exactly why George can't stand him. Because if Brian's a good guy and Annie isn't making a mistake, then she will get married and George will lose her forever. Brian sees Annie and kisses her passionately, and George feels something inside him break. He starts interrogating him. What does he do for a living? Brian answers that he's an independent communications consultant. Independent, of course. To George, that can only mean one thing. Unemployed. Brian explains that he works with banks around the world. He installs new technologies and that he's independent because his services are so expensive. No company can afford to have him on staff. George isn't convinced. And then he sees Brian's hand on Annie's knee. It starts to move upward. George is about to explode. For George, seeing another man with Annie is just too much because it's a direct hit to a truth he refuses to accept. His little girl is no longer a little girl. She's a woman. Many fathers struggle to accept that their children grow up, and later, I'll explore 2 specific reasons that may explain this difficulty. Brian says he understands how they must feel. Their daughter just got back from abroad, and now she wants to marry a guy they've never met. Within reason, he wants to give them some assurance that he's a good citizen. He's never been married. He's never been in love before. And Annie is the best person he's ever met. He wants to start a family with her, support her in everything. He assures them this isn't a whim or the excitement of the moment. What he feels for Annie is real. Nina cries. She says it's the most beautiful thing she's ever heard, but George didn't buy a single word of it. Annie and Brian are going out for a walk. George tells his daughter it's cold out, that she should take a sweater. She replies that she's fine like this. George insists it's very cold. Annie ignores him. But then Brian says, yes, it is very cold. In that instant, Annie goes to get the sweater. George freezes. He realizes he's been replaced. Annie will always love him, yes, but he's no longer the most important man in her life, and he never will be again. This is the first reason why many fathers find it hard to accept that their children will have grown up and are ready to leave home. They sense they're no longer the center of their world. For many years, they were heroes. The children wanted to be around them, sought them out, needed them for nearly everything, and that gave them a deep sense of worth and purpose. Being a father meant being important and necessary. But when children grow up and start making their own decisions, creating their own space, relationships, and plans, everything changes. You're no longer the first person they call when something happens. You're no longer at the center of their life. And that can feel like a kind of grief, not because the love is gone, because the love is still there, but because it now occupies a different place, more on the margins. That can hurt, because it means accepting that it's no longer about protecting all the time, but about supporting from a different position, about being a witness instead of the main character. Just a quick pause to say that if you're enjoying this video and haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. It would mean a lot and really helps me keep making more videos and content like this. Alright, let's get back to the story. Nina is thrilled. Brian is perfect. He's everything a mother would dream of for her daughter, but George isn't buying it. It all feels staged. They don't really know him. The guy could have another family or a criminal record. A few days later, they go to meet Brian's parents. They live in an elegant, upscale neighborhood, and to top it off, in the biggest mansion of all. John and Joanna, the in-laws, welcome them, and to George's horror, they are kind, well-mannered, and charming. They say they're happy about Annie, that she's lovely, but they're also candid. At first, the news caught them off guard. They barely had time to get to know each other. George agrees with all of it, but they add, well, they're adults now. They can make their own decisions. Sooner or later, you have to let them go, and trust that what you did as a parent was enough. George starts to choke up. He's not ready to accept it. Here lies a possible second reason why many parents struggle to let their children go, because it also means letting go of a role that, for many years, defined who you were. When a child enters your life, everything begins to revolve around them. Your priorities shift and your mindset changes. Being a parent becomes part of your identity. And that comes with great responsibility, but also a huge sense of purpose. So when that child grows up and no longer needs your care the way they used to, you're just not letting them go. You're also letting go a part of yourself. And it's not easy to redefine yourself overnight. George told Annie to bundle up like he's done all her life, but this time she didn't listen. Instead, when her fiance said the same thing, that's when she put the coat on. And that hurt, because for George, taking care of Annie had always been his responsibility. That was his role, and now that place no longer belongs to him, at least not in the same way. George needs a break. He sneaks off to the bathroom and finds John's private office. Curiosity gets the better of him. He snoops around and sees a bank book. He peeks at the balance and nearly has a heart attack. Suddenly, he hears footsteps. The maid walks in. George drops to the floor and hides under the desk. Then he hears a growl. And another. He's face to face with John's Dobermans. He's trapped. His only way out? The window. He jumps into the yard, and the dogs chase him. He ends up falling straight into the pool, bank book still in hand. Hours later, Annie asks how it went, and they assure her everything was perfect. Better that she doesn't find out. They start talking about the wedding. Annie brings up the guest list, and George panics. 600 people? He suggests something simpler. They could have a picnic. He can handle the grill. Nina scolds him. It's their daughter's wedding. It has to be special. She mentions that Brian's parents offered to cover half the cost, but George is offended. Maybe they don't live in a mansion, but they can afford a decent wedding. Nina drops another bomb. They're hiring a wedding planner. George doesn't get it. What's there to plan? It's just a wedding. Nina laughs. He has no idea what he's in for. The next day, they meet Frank, the planner. He starts with the cakes. Annie is delighted, but then George sees the price. $1,200 for a cake? It's just flour and eggs. Nina insists. It's their daughter's wedding. George looks at Annie and can't say no. Why do fathers seem to have a special attachment to their daughters? Why is it that when it comes to them, they simply can't say no? Could it be that there's something in that relationship that isn't present with their sons? We'll explore that in a moment. George receives the invoice for the guests. $250 per person. For 600 people, he nearly faints. He storms into the house and demands they cut the list. They start crossing off names, but there comes a point where they can't cut any more. So he suggests inviting some people, but not feeding them. He doesn't need to eat. Neither do the grandparents. Annie gets upset and locks herself in her room. Later, George finds her asleep, holding a magazine. How to have a beautiful and affordable wedding. Bake your own cake. Have a friend take the photos. Wear a simple dress. George's heart breaks. He wants to give his daughter the wedding she's always dreamed of. In that moment, he decides to stop complaining. There's something special about the relationship between a father and his daughter. It's hard to explain, but many people have seen it or lived it. Several studies have found that, in general, fathers tend to be more tender, empathetic, and protective with their daughters than with their sons. One of the reasons has to do with physical differences. Women, in general, tend to be physically less strong than men. That doesn't mean they're weak, but it can create a perception of greater vulnerability. And when a father perceives that, something very primitive and automatic is often triggered in him, the instinct to care for and protect. A study published in Behavioral Neuroscience found that fathers' brains react more strongly when they hear their daughters' voices than when they hear their sons'. It was also observed that when fathers are with their daughters, they tend to use more affectionate and emotional language. But it's not about loving one more than the other. It's that this relationship awakens a different part of the father, the gentler part. Another reason may be cultural. For many generations, women were seen as needing protection, while men were taught to be strong and not show weakness. In that context, boys were expected to toughen up, not cry, while girls were allowed to be vulnerable. And that may be why many fathers soften when it comes to their daughters, why they're more patient with them, why it's harder for them to set limits. That's why, even though George complained about the cost of the wedding, when it comes to his daughter, he just can't say no. He only wants to see her happy. And beyond any biological or cultural explanations, The truth is that for many women and their fathers, there's a special bond. That's why letting go is not easy. For the father who saw her take her first steps, who was there when she fell, when she was scared, when her heart was broken for the first time. Watching her get married is also kind of a farewell. At the wedding dance, he holds her. She rests her head on his shoulder, and inside, they both know something is closing. She's no longer the little girl who jumped into his arms, and now she belongs to another story. Annie and Nina are excited. They start searching for the best chef, picking out the most expensive flowers, and suddenly they get the idea that it would be lovely to have geese. And of course, if they're going to be geese, they'll need a pond. Since they want the wedding to feel intimate, they decide to hold it at home. But once they take a good look, they don't like it. So they begin remodeling, painting the walls, changing the light fixtures, getting rid of the sofas. At this point, I want to pause. Have you noticed that many weddings are incredibly extravagant? Why have weddings become like this? Is it social competition, tradition, or is there something deeper we're not seeing? We'll talk about that later. George tries to stay calm, but as the bills start piling up, he's about to explode. He needs a breather. He grabs his keys and goes for a drive, but Nina calls him. She says that since he's going out anyway, he should pick up dinner. George heads to the supermarket. He buys buns and hot dogs to make a quick meal, but when he realizes that the package has 8 hot dogs and 12 buns, something inside him snaps. He opens the bag and starts removing the extra 4 buns. The store manager approaches and asks him to stop, but George insists everyone is trying to take his money. Of course, since he can't put his foot down at home, he unloads all his frustration on the hot dogs and the store manager. The police arrive, and George ends up under arrest. Nina comes to get him, but before bailing him out, she tells him he has to listen to her. Annie's wedding is not a conspiracy against him. It's a celebration, one like millions of people around the world have. Yes, it's going to be expensive, but they can afford it. They've spent their whole lives saving for moments just like this. She tells him she'll bail him out, but only if he promises to stop stressing, to stop complaining about money, and to stop telling everyone how much the wedding is costing. George tries to justify himself, but then the guard clears his throat and says it's $250 per person. Nina asks him to think about Annie, because every time he complains, she feels guilty, as if she's being a burden. George gets it. They kiss and return home. Days go by, and Brian starts becoming more integrated into the family. They all play together in the yard, and though George doesn't want to admit it, Brian is starting to seem like a good guy. Then the first wedding gift arrives. Brian mentions the second is on its way. His parents are bringing it with them. George gets excited. He also has a gift he's been wanting to give. He runs to his room to grab it. But when he comes back downstairs, he sees that Brian's parents have gifted them a car. He stops in his tracks. He was never able to give Annie a new car. And now her in-laws show up and do it effortlessly. He looks at his small box and feels as small as it. Annie sees his gift and lights up. George feels embarrassed. He tells her he knows it's not much, but she doesn't care. She opens the box and finds a cappuccino machine. George explains he heard she wanted one. They told him it was a really good one. Annie is thrilled. It's exactly what she wanted. She hugs him and says she couldn't ask for anything more. George looks at her, heart full, and replies, "Neither could I." Months go by and the gifts pile up. The preparations build, and so do the bills. Slowly, George begins to relax, to enjoy the process. Until one night, Annie comes home crying. She had a fight with Brian. She's decided to cancel the wedding. She apologizes to her parents for everything they've done for her, but she just can't get married like this. George hugs her and makes it clear she has nothing to apologize for. Annie explains that Brian gave her a mixer, and she bursts into tears. George doesn't understand. She explains, to her, that meant Brian sees her as a 1950s housewife, someone who stays home, cooking. It scared her, what it said about his expectations. They argued, and it turned into a horrible fight. But what hurt her the most was the lie. Brian made up a ridiculous story that the day George met his parents, he snooped around, stole his father's bank book, and fell into the pool with it. George freezes. Brian comes to talk to Annie, but she doesn't want to see him. George offers to take him out for a bit, invites him for a drink. It feels like his chance to get rid of him and get his daughter back. But then, Brian says he bought the mixer because he knows Annie loves smoothies. He never imagined she'd take it the wrong way. But yes, he understands her point. George can see that Brian is sincere, and though it's hard for him to admit, he's a good match for Annie. George tells Brian that Annie tends to exaggerate, something she clearly inherited from his side of the family. But with that intensity also comes something else, her energy and passion. Brian smiles. He says that's exactly what he loves most about her. And then George understands. Annie is like him. Brian is like Nina. He can see they're going to make a great team. Being a father is one of the deepest paradoxes that exists. A child enters your life completely helpless. They depend on you for everything, first to eat and get dressed, then to do homework, ride a bike, and learn how to solve problems, and in time to manage emotions and begin to build their own life. What you teach them, or don't, will shape them forever. Caring for them becomes the center of your world, because all you want is for them to be okay, to have the tools to face the world. And here comes the hard part. Raising a child well ultimately means preparing them to no longer need you, to not rely on you anymore, not for homework, not for riding a bike, not for solving problems, to make their own choices, to build their life, even if that means doing it far from you. Ironically, the parents who do their job best are the ones who end up becoming unnecessary. And when that day comes, many parents feel lost, because while they spend years preparing their child to be independent, no one prepared them to let go. That is the great paradox of being a parent. You prepare them to move forward, and you're the one who stays behind. You help them find their path, and once they do, you have to give up your own. George returns home. He tells Annie not to be mad at Brian. It was just a misunderstanding. And also, that ridiculous story Brian made up was true. Annie decides to forgive her fiancé. They make up. They kiss passionately, and George chooses to look away. The day before the wedding arrives, and the house is in total chaos. Ice sculptures, floral arrangements, and even the geese. And now the question, why are weddings so extravagant and expensive? Have they always been this way? Or is this something we made up recently? If we look back through history, we see that weddings used to be much simpler. In many cases, they weren't even a big celebration. In ancient Greece, for example, they marked the occasion by sharing a sesame and honey cake with their family. In many indigenous cultures, it was customary for the couple to cook something together as a symbol of their new life together. And in medieval Europe, people gathered at home, shared a meal with close family, and that was it. Even well into the 19th century, many people got married in their own home or in the small village church, wearing the clothes they already had, no special outfits, and with only a few witnesses, the closest ones. The idea that a wedding must be a large, romantic, and expensive event is actually quite recent, and among the many reasons why, what might have been one of the most significant? In the past, marriage had nothing to do with love. It was essentially an economic or political agreement between families. You give me your daughter, and I give you land, cattle, money, or alliances. Marriage was almost like signing a contract, but starting in the 19th century, the idea of marrying for love became fashionable. It was no longer enough for the union to be useful or convenient. Now you had to truly love the other person. Marriage became something personal and emotional. If it was something that important, it had to be celebrated in a big way. Is that the only reason weddings became so expensive? Or is there something deeper behind why so many people go into debt just to get married? That's something I'll discuss later on. Night falls, and Annie is packing her suitcase. George watches from the doorway, and something inside him tightens. Matt, his younger son, says the house is going to feel strange without her. George replies, definitely. Matt heads to his room. From there, he calls out to Annie, good night, and she replies, I love you. It's the last time he'll hear that. He can't sleep. He tosses and turns, thinking about Annie. When she was a baby, when he took her to school, taught her how to ride a bike, when they installed the braces, her graduation. It all happened so fast. He hears noises on the driveway. Annie is playing basketball. She can't sleep either. George goes outside, and she confesses that even though she's happy to get married, it hurts to leave that house, that life, everything she's ever known. He listens and smiles. He then gives her some advice. He tells her that while changes can be painful, it's part of life. And with every change comes new things, often better things. This moment gives George exactly what he needed. The understanding that even though his daughter has grown up, his role as a father is not over. Because no matter how old Annie is, he'll always be her dad. And no matter how independent she becomes, she'll always need someone to listen to her, guide her, and be there for her. Yes, maybe she doesn't need him the way she used to. George's routine, his identity, and sense of purpose will no longer revolve solely around her, but his presence still matters, even if now it comes from a different place, with more distance, and with more respect for her autonomy. The role of a father can transform, but it never disappears. Suddenly, it starts to snow. Annie smiles when she sees the snowfall, and so does George. She notices and asks, are you already worried about how much this is going to cost you? He replies, no, I was just thinking I'll never forget this moment. The morning of the wedding arrives. Everyone is ready. Then George goes to get Annie, and when he finds her, already dressed in white, he's left speechless. Minutes later, they're standing at the start of the aisle, and George thinks this is the moment he's feared for 6 months, or maybe the past 22 years. But at the other end of the aisle is Brian, and he knows he's a good guy. So he takes a deep breath, takes his daughter by the arm, and hands her over to the man she chose. George takes a seat on the bench, and while everyone else looks ahead, he looks back. He thinks about how he won't see her in pajamas at night anymore, or waiting for him at the top of the stairs, or sleepily coming downstairs for breakfast. His heart tightens. But she looks happy. He can't help but smile. He takes Nina's hand and takes a deep breath. Annie and Brian say, "I do." They become husband and wife. Now it's time for the party. The house looks spectacular. The flowers, the tables, the champagne, even the geese. And now the remaining question. Why are weddings so extravagant? Is it just for aesthetics, social pressure, or is there something deeper behind it? As we saw earlier, since the 19th century, marriage stopped being a simple contract between families and became something emotional and personal, a transformational moment in a person's life. In other words, it became a rite of passage. A rite of passage is a ritual that symbolically marks the end of one stage and the beginning of another, like a sweet 16 party, a bar mitzvah, or a graduation. These are events that help us understand and feel that something important has changed. Anthropologist Arnold van Gennep explained that these rites don't exist just to celebrate, but serve a psychological and social function to help us process the major transitions in life. When there's no clear rite, the change can become confusing or even traumatic. The ritual brings order. It gives form and meaning to what's happening. On the other hand, mythologist Joseph Campbell said that rituals don't only operate on the conscious level, but also the unconscious. They're a symbolic way for the mind to absorb what is already happening externally. Without them, change may happen in reality, but we may never fully internalize it. And philosopher Charles Taylor added something crucial. For a ritual to truly work, it must be invested in with time, preparation, energy, even money. Because if we treat it like just another day, the mind will too. And so, even if something has changed, emotionally, we won't register it. But when we make it special, when we plan, invest, and come together, we send a message to our mind and to our surroundings that this matters. And that signal helps us process it, to understand with all our senses that we're closing one chapter and opening another. Perhaps that is why weddings have become so massive, expensive, and sometimes excessive. Yes, of course, capitalism, marketing, social pressure, and the desire to impress or show off all play a role. But there also seems to be a human need to mark the moment, to say that this is not just any day, but probably the most important day in the lives of the couple. They're at the wedding, but George is so busy making sure everything goes perfectly that he misses most of it. He hasn't even had a moment to see or talk with Annie. When he finally comes to his senses, it's already time for her to throw the bouquet and leave for her honeymoon with Brian. People gather around to say goodbye, and George gets stuck in the crowd. He doesn't make it in time. Annie looks for her father, but she doesn't find him. And although she wants to wait, she has to go. She throws the bouquet. She gets in the car and leaves. George runs, tries to reach her, but it's too late. Annie's already gone, and he didn't get to say goodbye. Devastated, he waits for the party to end. And suddenly, the house feels empty. Not just because the guests have left, but because Annie's also gone. Then the phone rings. It's her. George lights up immediately. Annie tells him they've arrived at the airport, but she didn't want to leave without saying goodbye. And before hanging up, she says, "Dad, I love you." It's everything George needed to hear. He wishes her a wonderful honeymoon, sends her a kiss, and they hang up. And as Annie heads off, George looks at Nina and remembers the life that they, years ago, also began this way. Being a father, when the word is lived in its truest sense, is one of the most generous acts there is. You care, protect, sacrifice, and accompany, knowing that one day it'll be your turn to stay behind. And even so, you do it. You don't expect to be repaid for the effort, the time, or the love you gave. You only hope that they too learn how to give it. And so life goes on. Someone once held you. You will hold others, and they will do the same for those who come next. Perhaps that's the most admirable and beautiful thing about the cycle of life, that so many people devote their days to caring, shaping, and letting go, so that others may walk. Letting go of a daughter can be painful and difficult, but it also means you did your job well, that you raised a woman capable of loving, choosing, and building her own life. A father's love doesn't go away, it simply changes place. And that is perhaps one of the purest and most selfless forms of love, letting go without stepping away. Thanks for staying until the end of the video. Don't forget to subscribe and share it with a friend who you think might enjoy it. And you and I'll see you in the next one.